welcome to Varn Blog. I'm here with Nicolas D. Villarreal. I don't know why I turned your name German all of a sudden. And we are talking about three articles that are related, but we'll get to the thread that runs between them. A sketch of a revision to orthodoxy, which is about incorporating the Kacki profit equation into Marxism. An economic theory of maximalist risk management, which is about basically the end. I would say the book that you are referring to is about the end of Fordism. But
yeah, basically.
And then the elephant in the room, which was Contra Capitalism as Abstract Dominion, a review of mute compulsion by Soren Mao. And I have to tell you, I'm not as sympathetic to my old frenemy Douglas Lane as I used to be, as I don't think his Marxism has any Marx in it either these days. But he used to say that the history of Marxist theory post-1950 was basically how to not be a Marxist and say you are. And I really do feel that lately when I see what becomes like hot in the Marxist theory world, for usually in 2 years of a time. And I actually appreciate the EndNote people because they don't actually really say they're Marxist, but the lot of the value form people kind of aren't either. And we'll get into that. But I remember like Kohei Sato and Soren Mao were like the biggest names in Marxism for a while in the theoretical front. And I do think we've been kind of benefited by some other things that are more historical, like Leibold's Citizen Marx and stuff becoming more of a focus. But before we get into the specifics of your economic critiques here, why do you think there's so much Marxology that doesn't have a whole lot to do with Marxism? Or if it does, it's actually ignoring some like basic, obvious things that are in key text.
Yeah, I definitely think that this has been like a trend for decades now. I guess probably since the 50s, definitely the 60s.
Yeah, it's pre-New Left for sure. It's
Yeah. I always come back to Marcuse because that's what I read in college. And I was like, this is like the most idealist thing. It does nothing to do with what Marx was talking about. Like maybe it has some insights, but it's not. This is not what it was about, right? And this is similar to like what is going on in mute compulsion, which I mean takes some things from Marx, obviously. Like the part that it gets correct is like the domination that the proletariat feels from market forces, which is a pretty basic. How people need to eat and they need to buy stuff on the market in order to eat. So they need to sell their labor in order to buy that stuff. And they were deprived of means of self-reliance because of primitive accumulation. So they have no alternative. But what happens is that the main thing he dismisses is like productive forces determinism associated with orthodox Marxism, which is like I paint it as a straw man in certain ways because he kind of portrays it as just being about like the technology as opposed to like how that was integrated with the tendency for the rate of profit to fall.
Right. I want to comment on that because a lot of the critiques of productive forces determinism are based on ignoring two things. One, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall being part of what informs it. Two, the organic composition of capital being a driver in and of itself, which can look like an accumulation of technology, but it isn't just an accumulation of technology. And three, which also takes care of some of the other critiques, the modes of production emerge out of relations of production, which is where the superstructure dips into. Like, if you think about it, the metaphor, it is almost like a yin yang,
Mm-hmm.
very bad, where there's like this little spot of things we associate with the superstructure and what defines the relations of production in the modes of production. And these people just sort of ignore that, like, entirely. Like, and I'm always confused as to like what they're responding to. It feels to me like they're responding more to G.A. Cohen than to Marx, are the people that thought that exactly what you're saying, that modes of production were just Whiggish technological developments. That's G.A. Cohen. That's
Well,
Marxist.
and also Stalin's line, but yes.
Well, G.A. Cohen, weirdly, even though he was an anti-Stalinist, accepted the Marxist Leninist Soviet version of modes of production, like, without any critique. It was weird, actually. So yeah, I want to let you finish. It's always, I find this interesting because a lot of times I'm like, you're critiquing something that's wrong, but this is not what we historically believed either. Like,
Well, I mean, he does cite some Kacki and Hilferding also, and dismisses them in like the same vein.
mm-hmm.
Like the problem that he has with it, I think it, like, part of it is because he is drawing on these traditions of value form theory and communization adjacent stuff, because he doesn't like want to admit that there are these progressive tendencies in capitalism. Like, what, there's no examination, for example, of what, like, okay, there's these economic forces of domination, and there's the how it applies to proletariats, and there's how it applies to everyone else, is how he puts it. And there's no like specific examination of how it affects capitalists, because if there were, like, the fact that market discipline forces capitalists to actually economize production and use the most efficient production techniques available, like, he tries to like weasel his way around that a bit with saying that, like, oh, well, because like the water wheel was more intermittent, even though it was lower cost, it got replaced by coal and fossil fuels. So that disproves the notion that like capitalists will always choose the most efficient method of production, which yeah, there's going to be some like divergences there. There's also just the fact that having like the energy source be less intermittent is going to be more efficient from a time perspective. But it's like by ignoring all of that and trying to sidestep it, he doesn't want to like he's basically burying Marx's main thesis in in Capital and also the Manifesto and basically in everything after like 1848, because it like everything like that he wants to emphasize is like that whole it's pure relations of production, which the relations of production are very important, but he doesn't want to like deal with the forces of production as something that might be progressive in any way, because that is kind of like opposed to the politics, I think, of this broader theoretical milieu. At least that's the way I perceive it.
Well, I mean, we have to think about let's say, what is Mao's milieu, which is the new Marx lecture. I'm just going to say it in English because trying to get that new Marx lecture
Yeah.
right is kind of a pain in the ass. Which is Mega 2 scholars. I mean, that includes all kinds of people I like Tarcel Carver and Marcel Musto, people I'm kind of neutral on, like Kohei Saito. Well, I'm not really neutral on Saito. I like Saito's earlier work, and the more he got into Engels is the problem, and his definition of degrowth, which when I actually read what he was suggesting wasn't even as radical as I thought it originally was. I'm sort of skeptical of. I'm skeptical of the monopoly capital school, Baron and Sweezy to some degree as well, although I think it has a little bit more validity to it. And these people come out of that world. And then adjacent to that as well, you have value form theory, which is tied into the new Marx lecture from Heinrich, which is I would say a particular reading of I. Rubens. The more I've actually read Rubens, the more I'm like, I don't think modern value form theory actually is what Rubens was exactly talking about, but I can't quite put my finger on the difference, except that somehow a lot of the conclusions of value form theory either end up being whatever communization is talking about, or Keynesian style social democracy tote court
Yeah.
based on something like a Marxist version of modern monetary theory, like which is to say it either becomes managerial or total rupture, right? So I mean, this is interesting because you do take other things into account. For example, you talk about how Kacki, who I don't, was Kacki a Marxist? I'm
He
actually
was a
unclear about
Marxist.
it. Okay.
He was greatly inspired by Capital Volume 2 when he came up with the equations. Like, they basically distill like those insights from Marx, in my opinion.
I mean, I think it's interesting. We talk a lot more about Grossman, who I also like. I'll defend Grossman. That's Henrik Grossman, the Polish German Frankfurt School member who got kicked out, and basically was a person who tried to figure out the theory of the rate of profits to fall in a much more worked out way. He has some critiques of Marx. I know people like Andrew Kleiman don't like it, but I think Kacki is more interesting to me because Kacki actually kind of figures out a business cycle equation that also explains class conflict. So we can get into that in a second, but it does seem to me that like Kacki's and answers to those people who like the post Keynesians who say, well, Marxism just doesn't try to work this out empirically. It's all immanent critique or total abstraction that doesn't have any, non-class war predictions about how the economy works. And I just didn't think that's true. Okay, go ahead.
Well, it's funny because I mean the post-Keynesians will often draw on Kacki, but they draw on the parts that I don't really emphasize. Like Kacki, he wrote down like these accounting accounting identities, but he also had some equations like what will probably describe these causal dynamics, and it's the causal dynamics part that mostly they're focused on, that they take away from Kacki, because they'll look at as profits rise, it means more capitalist consumption, like less capitalist savings, and some other things like that. That also there was a book recently that was like was like the making of a ruin or something about the fall of the USSR, which was like that they needed to be like citing Kacki for why they needed to pivot to more consumption in the Soviet Union. Like consumption-led growth is also like a way you can interpret like the equations. But it's like that what all of this ignores specifically is that, and this is the graph I've been coming back to a lot the past few weeks, is that what's like the relationship between capital intensity and labor productivity, which is something that Marx talked about directly as one of the tendencies of capital accumulation. That as you had an expansion of the means of production, that you had rising labor productivity, both as a cause and a consequence of that. And this is like very central to everything that Marx describes about the logic of capital and capitalist development, because this is going back to the manifesto. It's like all about the revolutionizing of means of production, the mode of production, like this tendency towards growth and the development of the productive forces, and all of that dynamism comes from this tendency for increasing capital intensity, which is the same thing as the organic capital or organic capital composition.
Right. I'm going to pull up this chart from this article, and I'm going to describe it for listeners because I know not everyone watches the show. A lot of people listen. But you came up with this based off Kacki, and I have like some technical points I might not even differ with you, just might point out. But if you use these equations, you have high investment, low exploitation rate, social democracy, USSR. I would say US Fordism also is that. Which tends to come after a period of class struggle, but also in a prosperous period. Like then you have high investment rate, high exploitation. Now, this is interesting to me because a lot of people will go, okay, but these are not all capitalists. And I would say, yeah, they're not. Some of these dynamics are larger than capitalist dynamics.
Yeah.
So you have a high investment rate, high exploitation rate. And the kind of exploitation that we're talking about in terms of the early Roman Empire is extraction or I mean, that's an area where you could technically get iffy about whether or not you would consider the Roman Empire highly exploitative or highly expropriative or extractive. And we could make hay about that. But the same basic logic, according to Kacki models, would still apply. You have a lot of use of labor surplus, but it's being reinvested at very high rates. It's not being hoarded in individual profits. You have low investment rate, low exploitation / expropriation rates. I'm going to just add the expropriation rate. Hope you don't have a problem.
Okay.
Which is subsistence farming, hunter-gatherers, capitalist policies that completely fail. Like South Sudan or something. And then you have the reason why people confuse neoliberalism with feudalism, which they're not the same thing, but this is what they share: low investment rate and high exploitation rate. So low growth, lots of hoarding of value, whatever the value is in that society. Now, we could go into why that's still not neo-feudalism, because feudalism is a different mode of production, but the trends of investment are the same. You have low investment into infrastructure. I mean, that's obvious everywhere. And high exploitation. So you want relatively high profit rates, relatively high prices, relatively high capture, but it's not going into anything. It's just being hoarded. And one thing I would point out is, according to your theory and according to this chart, which those of you who are listening, I just took down, feudalism and neoliberalism are sides of transitional. I wouldn't say modes. They're not transitioning to different modes. Well, feudalism was, but they're transitions that don't really go anywhere. Okay, so what I mean by neoliberalism. Neoliberalism returns profitability to the markets and expands the finance sector dramatically, as well as some other things we've talked about in the past, like petite bourgeoisification of elements of business that were not, creating more and more futures and whatnot, which are basically commodities based off of rents. These kind of things you see in neoliberalism. But as a way to fix the profitability on investment, it doesn't fix it. Right?
No.
And I
think what they can fix.
Go ahead.
Well, what they can fix, and this is very important, is capitalist consumption, right? So the full Kacki equations, for capitalist consumption. So you take gross profits, you take out investment, you take out trade surpluses, surpluses for government, like the opposite of deficits, and you take out I think those are the main things. I might be forgetting one or two. Oh, you take out worker savings, but that's harder to measure. And basically, if you do this, like if you look at like the U.S. Political economy under neoliberalism, like we have had rising deficits, which takes away from capitalist consumption because the capitalists have to buy bonds. And some of that comes from overseas and whatnot. And that's actually the other important thing is that the current account deficit, there's like a trade deficit that we have, that is increasing capitalist consumption because the capitalists, whatever they send overseas, whatever they export, they can't consume at home, even though it adds to profits. But what they import, they can consume. And basically, what the U.S. political economy has done is that it's done that it's had the rising trade deficits basically cancel out the rising government deficits, but it's also basically seen a decline in investment rates, which has allowed for greater capitalist consumption. And there's also you can break this down further with what about specifically profits to industry. So you take out rents and interest rates, and if you look at it that way, it looked really bad in the mid the 1970s and 80s because there was pretty much it was negative for those people. There was so much of the share of income that was going to interest. That it was basically this is why the economy was basically collapsing under the Volcker shock. But because the U.S. in order to deal with all of that, the U.S. economy basically just shut down investment. And I saw these comments from both Paul, or what's the New York Times economist guy? Sorry,
Krugman.
Yeah, Krugman and Milton Friedman, I think, was the other quote, both talking about how the U.S. has so much money coming in from foreign direct investment, the balance of payments, money coming in, that it must be because there are so many good investment opportunities in the U.S. And that this is why we shouldn't be worried about that as an increasing source of growth for the U.S. economy. But it's not a sustainable growth model. And the U.S., if you look at where the U.S. has been in the big chart of, I can link it to you if you want, of the relationship between capital intensity and labor productivity. The U.S. is a major outlier in that relationship, in that it has a much higher apparent labor productivity, which is real GDP to hours worked, compared to the capital intensity that we have. And this is a big reason why is that we have the large trade deficits and the money, the foreign direct investment, people buying U.S. bonds, other assets, is how this has been sustainable. The U.S. government, the U.S. is, if you look at the economies that have trade deficits and which have and rank them by their debt to GDP, the first one is Greece, and then the next two are the U.S. and UK. Other countries that are major reserve currencies, like Germany and or I'm sorry, the European Union and
you can
Japan.
just call it Germany. It really kind of is. But anyway,
that's why I said it. It was just a bit of a Freudian slip. But the euro and the Japanese yen, they have. I mean, there's lots of debt there, but they have trade surpluses, so they don't have the same pressures. The reason people get they get the euro and the yen is because there's lots of trade with Japan and the eurozone. The fact that the U.S. buys more from the rest of the world than it puts out should mean that people hold less of its currency. But the role that we play in the global financial system, and the basically the history of the Volcker shock and what Thatcher did in the UK have meant that there's this kind of mystique and like value preserving role of the dollar and pound in the global economy, which like the UK has already snapped back in terms of that relationship between labor productivity and capital intensity. The past decade, or ever since 2008, basically, they've had stalled real GDP per capita growth, stalled labor productivity growth, because they snapped back to the mean, basically. And that I anticipate that something similar is going to happen to the U.S. That the UK is a window into our future.
Yeah, well, I mean, as the UK goes to Argentina, so do we. And I think this is an interesting point because it does two things that are often hard for Marxists to deal with. And the Kacki, the reason why I asked you about the Kacki is I know Kacki being referenced by post-Keynesians way more than Marxists. Marxists kind of ignore him.
It's a shame.
That's why I was like I thought he was a Marxist, but I'm not 100% sure because Marxists don't talk about him very much. But what is this interesting is it describes the conditions of modern monetary theory, but also makes it very clear like why most versions of it, like Yanis Varoufakis, are utterly wrong. Mm-hmm. But people might go, well, what do you mean by that? And I'm like, well, it's not domestic consumption that keeps all this afloat. If it was a closed system, it actually wouldn't work. And that's also true for Japan and Germany, although they'll talk about the EU's fiscal constraints on Germany. But it's why I think, for example, people get very confused about the United States. Because one of the points that you make that's interesting is that we have a profitability problem. We are still a major world producer. We are still the second or third major world producer. But the thing is, a whole lot of our production is internal. Mm-hmm. Like we are a massive consumer of goods, and increasingly 10% of us are a massive consumer of goods. So that means you have literal wealth hoarding. I mean, that's what that means. And people have I think a lot of people on the left have confused that wealth hoarding with what Marxists mean by profits. They think that, oh, we have billionaires and, approaching trillionaires. That clearly means things are profitable. And I'm like, look at the line item on investments. What do you get on average per item sold on a physical commodity or a commodity that isn't tied into the state through rents? And you'll just start seeing those margins have dropped precipitously, not just in old school physical commodities or directly extracted commodities like oil, although it's very true there as well until you hit a very low supply. The other thing that you see is this is also true for things like services and other things that you would consider, there's a lot of variable capital in services. You'd think they'd be very profitable. They follow this trend too.
There's been some relief under neoliberalism, but there hasn't been there's been basically a stall of the trend for profits to fall. They still haven't improved very much. But this is also isn't sustainable. If you look at the amount of public and private debt globally that has what it looked like as a percent of GDP. I saw a study going all the way back to the 19th century, and it's very stable until you get to 1980, and then it just goes up linearly. And that I think has really softened a lot of budgets for enterprises in major capitalist countries like the U.S. And is why the investment has fallen off. But there has been all the measures I was talking about earlier to increase capitalist consumption. So I made a graph of looking at how much money it would take to get like the median or the average income of today in like today's dollars, and that number grew precipitously from like the 1929 to 1980. It went straight up to like from like 200,000 to like 1.2 million, and then it fell, and then it never recovered. It like unlike the rate of profit, which is like stalled out, that amount of what it takes to actually make it as a capitalist fell considerably. Because the capitalist consumption rate, as we mentioned, is several other things involved there. And basically, we've been propping up this capitalist class by mortgaging our growth, basically, and basically just hoping that the rest of the world props us up with the money they send us.
Which is getting harder and harder for that to happen for a variety of reasons. Like,
Yeah.
yes, people like Michael Hudson, who've been predicting the imminent and immediate collapse of the dollar, have been wrong. But no, that doesn't mean the dollar is going to stay strong forever, nor could have Biden's policies ran infinitum done so. Part of the problem that you have with like liberal and heterodox left thinkers, and I mean this as a deep critique, is they think in terms of election cycles, not in terms of even decades. And
well, I think it's even deeper than that, because, and this even goes back to Mao's book, because I think that there's a deep inability to face up to like reality, in much the same way that like the USSR and the Eastern Bloc was able to just keep financing things to keep going. Like that they were unable to deal with their soft budgets as a political problem. So that eventually it became a problem at the largest scale of abstraction, which was international markets and the dependency between like the global economy. And the same thing is basically happening now with the U.S. and U.K. economies, in particular, because we are we're not as dependent on energy anymore, but we're still dependent on the rest of the world for all sorts of things. Cheap final consumption goods, but also machinery, electronics that are important for businesses.
Basically, even though we're resource rich, we haven't been doing the investment in the machinery to run this stuff. We've been relying on other countries to do it because it's cheaper for labor, and we can hide our own profitability problems. Am I wrong about what you're implying there?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's right. And but the way this relates to Mao and the left is that Soren Mao and the left is that people have just think that this can continue forever. That there's no facing up to the fact that at some point you have to deal with hard budgets and hard choices and trade-offs. Mute compulsion as an idea is kind of presupposed on the idea that this is a sort of domination that we are trying to abolish in a certain sense. He doesn't go that far. He's careful not to actually say that we're just trying to abolish economic domination. But there's no facing up to the way that in the post-Keynesians and the MMT people are like this, especially, is that at some point we'll hit the hard limits of the economy. No, we already hit the hard limits of the economy in 2023 of what the government spending can do. There is no easy fix to these things. You have to start thinking about more concretely and more hard-nosed about how to improve the situation, which is also why the abandonment of productive forces is such a problem, because the U.S. is not exempt from the dynamics of economic development. All the conversations that happen, and this is my problem also with the Jacobin crowd when they were talking about the in the book Flowers for Marx, because like the way that they talk about the Jacobin people talk about social democracy, that they can just um, will this into be with like a political power, class conflict in the traditional way, trade unions, and so on. Um, like it doesn't it doesn't face up to like the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Like they avoid it in that way.
It doesn't fade up to the fragmentation and petit bourgeoisization of the labor market. It doesn't actually like. I might even be harsher than you. I actually have talked to people about the Jacobinites, and I've said, for all their critiquing people like me as being ultra leftist and book group readers and whatever, I think they are the most utopian of any of us because they really do not look at anything but immediate trends, and they really seem to think we could will ourselves back to a 1950s economy, and that's not possible to do.
No, it's not. And you have to confront that the expropriation of the capitalist class and using their surplus more towards investment isn't just like a nice thing. I honestly think that a lot of people when they talk about this, they're just thinking we're going to shift this to consumption. Like no,
Right.
You can't do that. This isn't just like the way that like everyone is thinking that they can just have everything, and no one is thinking about economic constraints on the left.
Or if they are, it's only in terms of raw throughput and like social,
yes.
like environmental degradation. It's not in terms of other structural limits. But for example, I've told people like, okay, so I accept that the MMT description of money is more or less correct, and we're not dealing with commodity money like Capital Volume 1 is based off of. Although I'm going to argue that Capital Volume 2 actually does start to deal with this problem, and Ms. Marx never finishes working it out. But I'm going to accept that. That doesn't change the fact that even with all the liquidity in the market, the profit margins per item have not increased. GDP, which while I admit is an imperfect statistic, does not ever go past 5% in a developed economy. And if you bracket out things that are transfers of wealth and not creations of value by commodity exchange, like the GDP would be even lower.
Mm-hmm. I like with that labor productivity thing, like if the US like GDP reflected the labor productivity implied by its current level of capital intensity, our GDP per capita would be about 30% lower.
That's bad.
Yeah. Now, if in a crisis, we probably wouldn't see a decline of 30% GDP. We'd probably see a whatever decline caused by the immediate crisis, and then like a stall as like we eventually catch up to where it should be, which is how it went with the UK. Well, of course, you never know. It could just be totally mismanaged by U.S. authorities. But it's like this is not like the path that the U.S. is on isn't sustainable, and everything, all the policy debates we're having is like people are like on the left thinking, how can we just like make things nicer for people? Which yes, we need to think about how to make things nicer for people. We also need to think about like the reason we need to expropriate now is very necessary reasons to continue basic economic development, to catch up to where the Chinese are going, like that, and also just and we can, and there are ways to relax the pressure of economic domination because you don't want the market to just decide everything. The way you do that is through having like actually understanding what it takes to live in a self-reliant way, and that understanding, that knowledge doesn't exist in capitalism because it can't exist. The whole premise of capitalism is everyone being interdependent on the market, through the market. And this is what I was writing in that economic theory of maximal risk management.
Well, yeah, I was going to bring that to you because it seems like, you know, even the way we're talking about it, we haven't systemically laid out why these three articles are related, but they very clearly to me are. And it's almost like, here's the problem. Look at Kacki. These are some ways that people have tried to deal with the solution. Let's do a tale of two books. Here's the most popular, one of the most popular theory books from 2023. And then here's a book that like nobody read but you. I'm sure more people read it now.
Well,
but it
the
did not have the buzzer.
Was the Triumph of Broken Promises was because it got recommended by the Odd Lots guy, Joe Weisenthal.
Right. Well, I mean, this is what's crazy. I have better reading lists for Marxists coming from the fucking not even post-Keynesians from twos than I do from Marxists right now. Because I also listen to Odd Lots, and I'm like, business people listen to this. Like, you know, like, and I think that's the Bartel book is interesting because it does lay out a problem, basically, that socialist states, because they hadn't fully achieved socialism, got into the same rut as capitalist states at the end of the Cold War, and that prompted a failure of legitimacy. But our failure of legitimacy was actually somewhat delayed because it should have maintained after the 70s, but the end of the Cold War made it look like we were still viable. And that is also because, as I've told other people, the U.S. didn't so much win the Cold War as Russia or the USSR just lost it.
Yeah.
Like, your opponent can lose a thing and you not actually have done anything or won on any value of your own, and still may be heading for massive catastrophic consequences from not dealing with that. And I do think there's been a hubris in the West after the 1990s that has led us not to deal with failures that were obvious in the 1970s. And we have not dealt with them since then, other than some neoliberal return to capitalist upper class consumption and hoping that high levels of debt can keep enough liquidity in the working classes that everything doesn't completely fucking fall apart. And we really are on the bounds that maybe we are about to see some stuff really break. Now, you know, I admit that you and I are both skeptical of the Marxists who are always like, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall means it's finally over. It's happening. You know, like, I'm not sure that that's where we're at. But I do think that this is a major problem. I just want to hear you like talk more about what you think about that. Cause I went through this and I was like, oh, I get why these are paired, right? Why you paired this with the Mao when we wanted to talk about this. Cause when you wrote these, you didn't necessarily write them as linked pieces, but they clearly kind of are to me.
Well, I'm actually thinking of putting everything together in like a pamphlet of some sort for my political economy research. It's a work in progress. But like with the book
Your second book.
Yes. I did the first one. I was like, this is a lot of fun. So I think I'll do another one because there's no pressure from like an editor to like straighten this up. So I just get to put it out there. But like with the Triumph of Broken Promises book, the funny thing about that is that like they don't seem to get, like, maybe I missed it somewhere, but like they mention, like in the situation with Poland, that Poland sacrificed investment in order to make its like international payment obligations, and like there's not this. I don't think they quite understood that the U.S. has also sacrificed investment, not quite in such a stark way, but by increasing its reliance on international finance and like taking on the role that we did and allowing this like big increase in access to debt and credit, that the U.S. has also really allowed its investment rates to slump. And has allowed its economy to like sacrifice its long-term growth thing, and that the current growth is a bit of a mirage. Now, in terms of what that means for like a crisis, I have no idea if when that could happen. I mean, maybe if Trump lets the Chinese like flood the U.S. with investment, the problem is solved, right? Like there's always a chance that they could do something like that. But at the other end, like Trump could end federal, like the Fed independence in a few weeks or something, and we would have the crisis immediately, because then our role in the global financial system would be over.
Yeah, I would say when we're no longer a consumer, where it's safe to put bond investments, why the fuck would you need the dollar?
Yeah,
like unless we do gunboat diplomacy, but we're not really been that good at that lately either. So like, I do think this is kind of a key. This is a key, like, cold water to the face to a lot of the left schemas we have right now, because they just don't really deal with this stuff. I mean, honestly, I will be honest with you. I kind of think, for all my critiques that I've had today about like the post Keynesians and the MMTers, that they are almost more honest about it than the Jacobin crew is. Because what the Jacobin people use MMT for is like,
everyone gets a pony.
yeah, I mean, and or we could just if we just print enough money, we'd generate enough domestic consumption that we'd reindustrialize internally. It's actually pretty close to Trump's theory, to be complete. I know they don't like that when you say that's what they want, but I mean, like the difference is, like, Trump wants to gut the social safety net because he's got some misguided notion that would make people more likely to contribute, as opposed to, I don't know, just become so desperate they tear everything to the ground. But we're not there yet. We're not having bread riots yet. So,
well, the Jacobin crowd, they just will actively deny reality a bit, I think, because like the whole thing with Seth Ackerman never owned up to that error in like the rate of profit critique. They just totally got his math wrong, because he misread the paper he was citing for what depreciation rates were.
I remember that. Can you go over that? I mean, there's many things. Like, also, Seth Ackerman totally botched the understanding of what low income was and why it was affected by inflation, because he kept on talking about high debt levels of the very poor, and I'm like, the very poor can't get debt.
Yeah,
like you're talking about the lower middle class, bro. Ham, you're not talking about the very poor. Like, but go ahead.
What Seth Ackerman did is, like, he put out a big paper that was like a shot against Brenner, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or put up a Jacobin article, rather. And
Brenner Riley thesis, right?
Yeah,
yeah,
I think so.
Which that also has a ton of problems, but
yeah,
but Ackerman's complaint was not one of them.
No, Ackerman said that because he found this paper saying that depreciation rates were higher than people thought, that there actually wasn't a tendency for the depreciation or the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, and he misread it, because the line that, like, what he was saying was basically assuming that there was a big increase in depreciation rates, which is not what the paper said. He basically like took where like these stable depreciation rates that economists have been assuming, and then made it fall to that level, where really he should have assumed that there were these lower or higher depreciation rates the whole time, which would have created the same shape of rate of profit curve. And because he did that, it showed a big increase in profitability that basically nobody was suggesting happened. And certainly not the people he was citing. And there was originally going to be mentioned in like one of like Brenner's people's response in Jacobin, but the editors took it out. Because I pointed this out to them, and so they were going to put it in, but then the editors said no.
Yeah, because they just like, I mean, honestly, because if you publish that in that, then you have to be like, here's why this is a basic like undergraduate level mistake from one of the key thinkers of Jacobin magazine. But
This is like
mhm.
they've been very slippery with the facts sometimes. I mean, there was a whole thing I had, like problem I had with Vivek Chibber's class matrix book, which is like conceptually, well, he makes all the same mistakes about social democracy as Jacobin people do in general. But he also wrote the whole
And
book.
analytic Marxists do as a whole
Yes.
too, because the other thing is we should just admit that Hamilton and co are right in the Flowers from Marx book. The analytic Marxism is the unofficial, unstated party line um,
Jacobin.
of Jacobin. But since analytic Marxism fell out of favor academically in the 1990s for reasons of his own internal contradictions, I'm not talking about because it's not Marxist enough. I have a book by I believe Tom Mayer that sets out the criterion which analytic Marxists set for themselves, and he just systemically points out they don't meet their own criterion.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't see a lot more of it for a while, and then Chibber and Eric Olin Wright and co kind of become the grand dames of the Jacobin crew, at least their theoretical basis. And then like uh, you know, Matt McManus, who isn't so much a analytic Marxist. I don't know that I would call McManus a Marxist at all. And I mean, I like Matt, I really do, but I don't think he's a Marxist. I don't
No.
even know that he would say he's a Marxist. I'm actually would be interested in knowing that.
And
Um,
big things like liberal socialism. Uh,
right. Um, right. And he sees Marx as part of that tradition, but
yeah.
uh, whereas Ben Burgess is a Cohenite, specifically G.A. Cohenite,
Mm-hmm.
analytic Marxist, with some caveats like he won't say that there's no such thing as labor theory of value or even an imminent critique of Ricardian labor theory of value and Marx. He will just kind of say, I don't know, and move
Mm-hmm.
on. I
But
love
then
Ben,
he'll
but I've
cite.
always been frustrated with that. Go
But
ahead.
yeah, but then like in my review of Flowers for Marx, I was looking at the stuff he was citing, like this one terrible article
Mm-hmm.
to say that like that was published in Jacobin by I think an editor, that like Marx was basically a proto marginalist, and that all his critiques of supply and demand are um, like not are being misinterpreted, and despite that, like it is totally a wrong reading of what Marx was talking about. Marx hated all of the proto marginalists. He even the ones who drew like the Marshallian like cross graph. Like he knew one of them from Germany and hated that guy. Engels said specifically he hated that guy, and just made any person who was familiar with the history of political economic thought could have told you that that article was bogus. But it was cited by uh, uh, in the book and
Oh yeah, yeah, by Burgess, yeah.
by Burgess, and then he also like this really like galling argument by Steve Paxton, which I downloaded the book and looked it up to just see what he said about like how the experience of the Soviet Union collapse actually vindicated Marx because it started in like basically feudalism and therefore wasn't developed capitalism and therefore was bound to fail. And it's just analyzes what the conditions were at the start of the Soviet Union to say that, yeah, this is why it failed like 70, 80 years later, 90 years later. It just makes like the sheer changes in the economic system in Russia, the changes in the productive forces. You cannot. It is not a credible argument to say that the specific conditions of feudal Russia, like in the forces of production, led to the collapse of the USSR. That's not credible.
No, I mean the USSR was keeping pace with Europe and the United States in industrial production within 20 years. Um, we could talk about the problems with that, like it didn't build up its own domestic goods. I actually agree with the people who argue that. But that's not because it was feudal. Also, I mean, to me, it's like, well, then how do you explain what happened in England either?
Yeah.
Like, is there just some kind of magic to Protestant? I mean, like Protestantism that causes a change in exploitation type in rates. I think Brenner explained, for all my I have a lot of problems with Brenner these days. But Brenner does explain England fairly well, or at least I would say Aaron Milkins Wood's interpretation of Brenner explains England fairly well. To bit back to what were you saying about Vivek Chibber? What did he mess up in the class?
Like he makes the whole book as this like defense of a structuralist theory of class, but he never goes into what structuralism is or what structures are, and therefore what the structuralist class is. He just basically uses all of the analytic Marxists and more sociological stuff to argue about from incentives like a neoliberal economist would, right? And it's just very frustrating because why couldn't you have just looked at this tradition that does the thing that you're looking for and have had some sort of dialogue with it, which would have been the more academically rigorous thing to do.
Right. I mean, what's interesting is I can't even think of who they could go to for that. Which is Richard Wolff when he was writing with what's his face? Not now, Richard. Yeah, with Resnick, because there was very clearly a dialogue between Althusserian structuralism and analytic Marxism and Wolff and Resnick's 80s and 90s work. Not so much anymore. I don't really know what Wolff was on now, but I do think it existed even. This is neither here nor there. I am fascinated with the fact that there's a problem in the 1970s. There are 4 schools of Marxist historiography that emerge out of it, basically, that are not tied to the Soviet Union, and also weirdly don't get tarred in the Western Marxism debates today, because I don't think people understand that this would be more important than complaining about Marcuse. But you have the Monopoly Capital School, you have the Political Marxist School, which is Brenner Wood's, which has some ties to the Analytic Marxist School, and then there's the World Systems School. And I guess you could also throw Althusserian structuralism in there, although I don't, because it's a little bit before that.
And people, there's not that many of us anymore.
No, but the tension between the Lacashians and the Althusserians are actually why those 4 schools of historiography exist.
So do you know that meme about that boomer comic of this guy standing in line for coffee, and he's black coffee, and so, do you want espresso, mocha, whatever, all this bullshit? And it's just, I just want black coffee. I just want orthodox Marxism. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I find this very interesting to me because you have people have a hard time, for example, conceptualizing the problems that have emerged with the Democratic Party and the Republican Party today. And I theorize it as the following. The Democrats are in denial that their managerial system can continuously maintain high profit rates without inflation and or even further accelerating the drift of income up. and they cannot deal with the fact that they're so dependent on that upper capitalist spending, not just for obvious things like their own campaigns, but to maintain the economy, that they can't stop the way that it is siphoning stuff upwards, and then they just have to say it's a good economy based off that. Whereas the Republicans actually realize that's non-viable, but their solution is worse, which is basically deny organic capital. I remember my argument against Project 2025, which I now think is naive, not for the reasons people think. I always said, of course they won't try that. That's incoherent. Capital won't let them. And then I realized, no, they're throwing spaghetti against the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And capitalists know it. They're terrified because they know that the only thing holding their stock market up is the physical production around AI. I do not mean AI software. That's not profitable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean
capital investment.
I mean capital investment in chips and in data centers. That's it.
Yeah.
And so it's actually not even all the Magnificent Seven. It's like you and I were talking about this privately. It's like 3 or 4 of the companies in the Magnificent Seven. And then that's beginning to wane, and there's nothing else behind it. And they've also gutted all the social safety nets for reasons that I hate to tell people do make sense. I don't want to say it's good, and I don't think it has to be this way. But the bond market's gonna weaken, and if it does, you'll see a massive deceleration of the hoarding of dollars, and then it'll be quite like what the UK did to itself, and we'll have a massive inflation problem and a massive impoverishment relatively quickly, in a state that's floundering to respond to it. I mean, however ridiculous, Trump's America is, I hate to tell you, structurally, Britain right now is more fucked.
Yeah.
But
I mean, they don't have a real economy. They just have London. They just have their version of New York.
Right. Which I'm like, the reason why I always compare it to Argentina is I'm like, you know what places are like that? Stalled out low middle income countries in the developing world, like Guatemala.
It's funny because you can look at what the capital intensity is for Argentina, and it was a leading country 150 years ago or something.
Right.
And then it never grew its capital intensity. It just never put that money towards investment, and it got stuck there forever.
And still kind of is, actually.
Yeah. I mean, the big problem is that you do actually need to depreciate the currency. You do need to restore hard budgets to the economy. But the problem is that the only the Millet just wants to do that. He doesn't care what happens to people if you do that. A socialist government would figure out how to do this, how to actually plan the economy to restore self-reliance. That would be the proper socialist program there. But of course, Millet is not going to do that. The main if he's actually regressing back to the old Argentinian playbook, which is propping up the government by slowing the rate of the decline to the dollar, and just having the actual inflation be higher than the exchange rate fall. But if he was serious about actually just letting it free float, then he could stabilize the situation at the expense of virtually everyone in the country,
and then he would be ripped apart, literally. But yes, I mean. It would. I mean, this is one thing that you and I, when I talk this way, and I move a lot in MMT circles, I actually will I agree with MMTers about certain things. It is true the government can't run out of money. You know what though? Money is not value, and you don't seem to understand that. Mm-hmm. And they'll be like, well, value is some vague abstract thing, and then I'll be like, okay, but liquidity is not abstract. Power, the other answer, is not abstract. So power isn't abstract. Like, what are you on? Like, oh, value isn't real. And I'm like, I don't know, man. I can statistically model it. I'm sure. I mean, in theory, no, that doesn't prove it exists. I can statistically model a lot of things, but that's what you're doing with your alternate analysis, like power and whatnot. Except it's not as explanatory. And so, trying to get people to understand that, like, one of the things that you get into, we haven't talked about yet, but one of the crises for American capitalists is something forced valuation. Right? If we actually had something that forced capitalists to valorize their wealth, like sell stuff on the market instead of hold stocks forever through investment, it would become very clear, I think, that every one of the major capitalists, both as individuals and companies, are overvalued, and thus are guilty, thus have fictitious capital propping a lot of their valuations up. Right. Do you agree with me on that? I mean, like, that's my...
I mean, like the existing valuation is based off of like the massive profit in the economy. Basically, it's not totally unhinged from that.
No, it's not nothing.
Yeah, but it is like the massive profit that we have now is basically based off of unsustainable circumstances. And the growth models is how I would say it.
Okay. So, like, I would say that I'm not saying that the valuation is based off of just subjective whatever. I'm saying that if we were forced to have a reckoning through valuation, we would see that that we are projecting to the future things that are not projectable into the future, and those valuations would fall almost instantly. Yeah. And
that's basically by definition true, because every like if you ask these investors what they're doing, they're making a underwriting they're doing underwriting for these investments where they're laying out, well, what's the value of the future cash flow going like 10, 15, 100 years even, and some of that may be more realistic than others. But if you forced everyone to sell right then, you basically are just left with, well, what's valuable right now? And sometimes that happens. Sometimes there's like a crisis where you,
I don't know, really, like 1928. like I'm just thinking, like, the Great Depression is an example. The Long Depression's another one, actually. Like, in fact, I would say one of the ways we've dealt with risk management, this will get us back to one of the articles, is by making sure we don't ever call the cards on valuations at one time. Like we have structurally set up the economy so that is less likely to happen, which is why you've had less things like an obvious Great Depression. Today, I'm fascinated by the problem, though, because you and I haven't talked about this, but I'm like, the traditional ways in which we measure a recession, we are definitely approaching. But what people aren't factoring in is those traditional ways are based off of a couple of key assumptions that are no longer true. One of which is just growing population rates. Like, I'm like, well, if the population is shrinking both from lack of immigration and from lack of births, like, you could have a decrease in jobs and not have an increase in unemployment. Like, and actually, I think we see that. And then there's the shrinkflation of employment, which is like people who are contractors and gig work don't count, even if they're making sub-poverty wages. So this ties us back in, though. The Bartel book talks about risk management as one of the things that led to these failures in both the socialist world and the
it didn't talk about that so much as that's what I took away from it.
All right, so it's implied by it.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I've always found fascinating, right? I'm not a big Deng fan, you know this about me. But I do think that China also had the failure to deliver on promises era that the USSR had, but managed it way better by getting around the problem of productive forces by encouraging Western investment as opposed to Western direct extraction. So by encouraging Western parties to invest in Chinese production firms, opening up the market that way. But it did lead to a collapse of the Chinese social safety net in the 1980s. Like, that's actually true.
Yeah.
And they were able to right the ship basically between Hu Jintao and Xi. And Xi's policy came last. But even there, they have had to do that at slowing their own economic growth. Because this is one thing that, like, we just have to deal with, like the middle classes in China are still subject to the same pressures that the middle classes, like, in Europe are, if not America too. And I'm saying that to me because it does indicate that, like, they found a way to deal with this temporarily, but they're going to need to find another way long term to finish this transition.
Well, I mean, I think that they've actually they'll get there because for this simple reason that China has an extremely high investment rate, and because their investment rate is so much higher than the rest of, like, most normal capitalist economies. That's basically why everything's happening right now the way it is. That everybody feels the pressure from China, and it's not going away in quite the same way that it did when Germany and Japan caught up, because they're not, like, I mean, they have a ways to go before they reach similar labor productivity levels as like modern developed economies, and I don't anticipate them slowing down that sort of investment. Matter of fact, a lot of economists say that, like, they've been expecting that China's investment rates are going to fall, and basically, I expect the opposite. I expect that China, by pushing this like force onto global markets, is basically going to force the rest of the world to increase their investment rates that have been stalled since neoliberalism, basically.
So privately, you and I talked about this as an interesting conundrum because I said, well, this is why I view China as the most responsible capitalist country. And you more or less agreed with me, although you said, yeah, it's a way of state capital management that actually can discipline some of the worst excesses of the bourgeoisie, and not through the way that, like, people on Twitter imagine, like they're just shooting billionaires all the time, which they're not. They're just not. That's not, like, I think Jack Ma's still alive. Like,
he's still alive, and still, like, he even made a public appearance recently that seemed that he was back in favor a bit. But the fact that he disappeared after he made, like, comments critical of the government, basically on behalf of typical capitalist interests, it shows that they can't exist as, like, the capitalist class can't exist as a political actor really in China in the way that they are supposed to in every other, like, in bourgeois states around the world.
I mean, well, that makes China an interesting thing, though, because it is still subject to international market dynamics. It still operates within everything that we consider a capitalist economy, but it does have a way of limiting its capitalist class, or at least subordinating it in a class collaborationist way that other states have not managed to do, including ones with high government investment. I mean, like the Nordic countries. I do think that's an interesting problem. I mean, in that it actually could be, if done well enough, and if the U.S. fails as a countermeasure, it actually would give China the ability to put pressure on the global market in a way that could change things in a massive way, the way the U.S. did in the 1970s, honestly. I don't mean that, and they would do the same thing. They would definitely not. But I mean, in, like, U.S. Fiscal decisions started really affecting everywhere
Mm-hmm.
at that point, even though the U.S. productive economy was actually weakening.
Actually, this reminds me of a FT podcast I was listening to a while ago, where like
Mhm.
this is already true in certain ways, that the Chinese investment decisions are basically already impacting American like savings and investment like decisions. That like the reason that it's so difficult to like do manufacturing here as part of Chinese competition. Um, like if like if you force this much investment and just to build the absolute amount of industry, there's less room in like the global economy for everyone else. But if you want to compete, you have to invest and also put discipline to ensure that you're moving down the global cost curve, and that requires a lot more than what most countries are willing to do right now, especially the U.S., especially the U.K.
I was going to
Um,
say, I think in the cases of a lot of developing countries, that's not a willingness, that's an able. But in case of
yeah,
us,
yeah,
that's a willingness issue. Like we could have done something about this.
hmm
Um, even from as I've said before, is like even from a capitalist perspective, these people are bad at managing their own economies. Now, I have a theory for that actually isn't all that tied into Marxism, but you and I both are not necessarily opposed to supplementing Marxism with other theories. Um, but I do think it's because our elites are over specialized and under challenged and relatively isolated. And oddly enough, despite the way China's always depicted as an autocracy, and despite some problems with China that I do agree with, like I don't think China's always as good to labor as a lot of like MLs would want you to believe.
hmm
But there is a sense that they are at least trying to build up social surplus for something other than the massive accumulation of wealth. Um, they seem to be willing to tolerate some of that to get the production up.
yeah.
Um,
The point
and
in China is specifically economic development, which is going to put them at odds with capitalist consumption. And in the U.S. and the U.K. and places like it, the point is capitalist consumption, as far as it has been under neoliberalism. I am reminded, though, as you mentioned, like the situation with elites. There's this conservative commentator, Tanner Greer, who's like an acquaintance of mine, who is like a China specialist, basically, because I think he lived there for a bit as a missionary. But he was talking recently about like how stupid the recent stuff with the military has been, and he was saying how in China, Xi Jinping tells the cadres you have to have a catastrophe mindset, that if you don't do it right, there will be catastrophic consequences for the country. And that simply doesn't exist in the US. Everything is totally performative here, and intentionally so, by Trump and his administration. And that's probably not going to end well. But I do think there is a deeper structural thing here also of capitalist consumption, that they just cannot en masse like raise investment rates without causing a real political crisis. That like all of Trump's bases are like these petty bourge, like militant political types, and if there's no longer an economic base for them, and I've mentioned this to you before, it would be a really serious issue, and that I'm not exactly sure what would happen.
well, I mean, we have this problem in both parties though, because the base of the Democratic Party is investment capital plus proletarianized, and I use that advisedly. I do not mean poor. People be,
Mm-hmm.
oh, proletarianized, you mean poor. I'm like, no, I mean people who used to be in a petty bourgeois relation who are now in a wage relation, but they are in a wage relation dependent on government subsidies, not on the market. So we already, like, if you understand, I mean, I don't mean to sound like Michael Lind, right? But he's not wrong about this. If you understand this as a petit bourgeois versus professionals, and Marxists have a real fucking hard time not realizing that the professionals are no longer petit bourgeois, and this is bigger than a cultural issue. And it's not like the PMC exactly the way that is. It's not just about like your educational attainment and credentialing. This is about your structural relationship in the economy. More doctors and stuff are now wage earners than they were in the past. But all that stuff is based off government largesse, largely in post-industrial areas. And that's why stuff like the Big Beautiful Bill is so disastrous to the American economy, because you have all this professional stuff that's also supporting all these post-industrial areas almost entirely, which also, if they collapse, the rural areas that are dependent on the petit bourgeois development and on like large-scale wealthy farmers and whatnot, that also collapses too. Like, so you have two people who are economically at odds, but if either one of them win, they both fall.
Yeah.
It's a prisoner dilemma. It's a prisoner's dilemma of extreme proportions.
Yeah.
I don't think you have come close to that. I've been amazed that like it's been fucking people like Michael Lind and not Marxists who've looked at this. Marxists like PMC, they're really running everything. Guys, that have the last year, just has it disabused you of them actually really running everything? Because if it hasn't, you need to get with the fucking program. Like,
no, I've honestly been thinking about like Trump as a bit of like the American version of the Cultural Revolution. That like this is all like the Chinese had thousands of years to appreciate what like the social and cultural role of educated professionals were. And it is basically like in China, it was a literal aristocracy, basically. Like,
yeah, I was about to say, it was basically a kind of aristocracy we did not have in Europe, except maybe in very wealthy clergy. That would be except that these people weren't really clergy. They were their own social class. Like,
I mean, you have to remember, one, that like the Americans who were looking at the higher education system in Germany and brought it over literally talked about an aristocracy of excellence. And the Germans themselves were using higher education as a means to perpetuate their domestic aristocracy in like as trying to preserve it in modern capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, it was basically a way to like transition and while fully capitalist, modernizing and not getting in some of the traps that the English got into. That was what it was about. And I don't think people understand that. I was like, no, that's why Erno Mara was right. It actually took World War II to get rid of a lot of those fuckers.
But in the US, they're not like an economic aristocracy. They are proletarianized, as you're talking about. They exist basically as this ideologically coherent group, or not ideologically coherent, as in they all have this one political ideology, but they all have this ideological training as like the ideology of professionalism.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is one thing that I think maybe I'm going to give Althusser a little bit of credit for, is if you understand them not as a coherent class that is a clear new class like James Burnham tried to do with the managerial class. My thing is like these new class theories are interesting, and I do think professionals are a problem, but the problem that you have with them is when you look at them profoundly, you're like, yeah, but what you see is justifying this class is constantly changing. It was not originally and Burnham didn't give a shit about college degrees. Like, that's an Ehrenreich innovation. And Ehrenreich meant something. Ehrenreich thought that they were going to be a vanguard class aligned with the proletariat because it emerged from it, and she was wrong. And then we use it as a theodicy to explain why Bernie lost, and not that, you know, he didn't have any leverage in the Democratic Party, and also his platform doesn't actually make sense. I'm just saying, like, I know the Jacobin heads get mad at me when I say this, but I've always been like, you didn't even have a coherent theory of political economy undergirding all this. Like, Bernie is half MMT, half Keynesianism. I guess that's out of halves, but like a little bit of classical Marxism, like, but very little. It's not. I don't know. You know, like. it's like hearing Corbyn tell me about how an island off the coast of Europe is somehow going to return to an industrial policy of when it was an empire, without, with what material inputs again. I'm just always fascinated by the lack of thinking this shit through. And I know I sound like I'm ranting, sorry but it does seem to me that that China is interesting as a model, because when it comes to this risk management of the societies we're talking about, it's been the only one that's been able to I'm not even saying it's done it all. There's a lot of promises to the workers it hasn't fulfilled, but that's kind of been able to restore a social contract that people have faith in. None of the other BRICS countries have. The West countries haven't been able to do that. Post-communist Russia definitely hasn't been able to do it. So, that does not bode well for a lot of these schemes. And I think one of the things that we can get back into a little bit to get us back into Mao, and by Mao I mean M-A-U, not M-A-O, is it does seem like most of these theories don't deal with the Kacki thing, and they also treat capitalist polities as autarkies, even though they say they don't. There's the obvious things that like Benjamin Studebaker brings up, like capital flight, but there's bigger stuff than even that. Yeah. Or like, like Warren Moser, just when I would talk about like, what if other countries won't trade in your currency? And he just like, but they do though. And I'm like, but what if they don't though? And he's like, but they do though. And
well,
go ahead.
I mean, there's a funny example here in Cuba that has been going through a very severe economic crisis lately, which is mainly the result of like the tourist sector basically shut down during COVID. And because of that, they lost access to foreign currency that they needed to buy things like fuel. And because they didn't have fuel, that means that they couldn't use it on tractors and all sorts of machinery and equipment that was used to actually run the industries that were export industries to get more foreign currency, like particularly the sugar industry. And that led to a downward spiral where they couldn't produce more to get more foreign currency, so they kept getting less and less production. And now they're in this situation that basically now the Chinese are trying to bail them out so that they get solar panels and reduce their reliance on foreign energy imports. But the takeaway from that is basically that economies need trade both ways in order to usually need trade both ways in order to get the inputs that they need for their economy to work. Even China has lots of energy imports, has lots of imports for agriculture, things like that. The U.S. has a lot of natural resources exports, but we need those higher end machineries, electronics, things like that. Which, if we didn't have those, our economy would contract considerably. Now, this interdependence is really important because it's like I said earlier, people like capitalism requires interdependence structurally, because if you it's what forces people to engage in markets.
Right. I mean, that's why capitalism is a socializing factor, which I don't think people understand. They think it's only an atomizing factor. And I'm like, no, it's both. It is atomizing to other forces of civil society, but since it forces us into market engagement and market-related production, which forces us out of subsistence individual, which is still not truly individual, but like out of small family micro economies, into a macro economy in the market, it is a socializing factor. Like and that's like its dialect to sound like a bad Hegelian, which I know will make you cringe, Nico. But that is its dialectical tension, is that it's both atomizing and socializing simultaneously. So anyway.
No, I think that like this part of like risk management, like it's a part of like trying, like the main thing of socialism to me is like figuring out like, is people actually understanding how production works and how what the alternatives are in a specific situation for a society. And so like this sort of alternative planning, like today it only really happens as like military contingency plans, and on a very small scale. I'm sure the Chinese planners have like, well, if we lose access to the U.S. in a war over Taiwan, well, we're going to do this and this and so on. Um, like it's what is the bare minimum that you can do is like this certain like rationing. If you wanted, like if in order to spurn the market, you actually, whether it's like especially on this like international level, you have to understand what it takes to be to do autark production. That's the point I was making.
I would agree with you. I think that's also a paradox. Is like, for all my critiques of methodological nationalism, I do think honestly you have to look at national planning to even get a sense of the scale you need to operate at. But then you almost immediately have to then go, okay, but what are my non-national external limitations? And I have to deal with that. Um, and the global market does do, whether we like it or not, and whether we think it's efficient or not, or why it does it for what, does outsource a lot of that thinking about the competition between polities and states. So I mean, you would agree with me that that's one of the functions that it does.
Yeah, it's all it all goes into like insurance and derivative markets, right?
Right. Um, so I mean, I guess this brings us back though. You had a critique of Sora Mao that I think is interesting. Because if you look at this from a risk management standpoint, it becomes very clear that what's compelling capitalist is a very different set of concerns and motivations than what's compelling like the professionals and petite bourgeoisie, and definitely what's compelling the average working class person.
Mm-hmm.
But in Mao, that's not really differentiated. Am I
Yeah.
wrong? I mean, when I read the book, I felt the same way. So
Yeah, now this is one of the key points, because if he did differentiate it, if he understood what the different like tendencies in like incentives were on capitalists in particular, he would have to go back a bit more to the forces of production and how that determines things. Um, because the capitalists, like they have their, like it's a classic MCM. Their income is the difference between M prime and M, and because of that, they're always they're trying to minimize their costs, but in doing so, in order to expand their profits, they're always doing things like investing in new technologies and so on. And this creates the falling rate of profit dynamics, and the development of the productive forces more generally. And this is very different from what like the workers experience, um, and it's a problem like for Mao, because like I said before, like it would require recognizing that there are progressive elements to the mute compulsion of economic domination, right? And it would complexify a lot of his thesis, I think, of what that role is exactly. Um, like it, like we can't imagine a world without this sort of force, which is the same force as just that the general economic dependency we were talking about before. Um, like there's always going to be some of that, and when that's like The problem with capitalism is that it structurally creates that. You don't want that to be the case. You want people to be able to spurn the mark, like this interdependence, if they want to live relatively as they choose. But to the extent that it's a real thing, you have to respect it. And there's another thing here, somewhat like Mao doesn't do this so much, but I mean we can get into this later. It's like the relationship between like M prime and M, that is not actually like the growth mechanism of capitalism. Like national economy.
Sorry, Deleuze and Guattari.
No, this is a very important to like Deleuze and Guattari and Nick Land, who takes from them.
Yeah, the accelerationists in general. Yeah,
that they think that because a growth in the growth in M is the growth. No, the real growth comes from like the C. It comes from like expanding labor productivity and all that stuff. Like the growth in M is literally just central banks deciding we're going to print more money. And also it doesn't, like, you can have profits without growth. This is a fundamental of the Kacki equations, because of the fact that MCM is like, if you think about it as only one firm, you're not going to realize that like the profit in an economy is equivalent to capitalist consumption plus investment, because those are like the spending that the capitalist does at the same time that they're buying the means of production and the labor power to produce things. This is a big misunderstanding caused by Deleuze and Land and people like that. The capitalism is not going to expand infinitely necessarily because of profits. At some point, we're going to hit limits of, like, one, the monetary thing is totally arbitrary. Two, like eventually, like there's going to be structural limits to how much you can invest, and that'll be that. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. I mean, this has been the problem of both left and right accelerationism. Right accelerationism is just, it expands infinitely and it becomes infinite progress, and even if it destroys humanity, blah blah blah, and trying to stop it, as Peter Thiel says, now is the Antichrist. I will admit, our capitalist overlords have done a lot of meth, allegedly. Allegedly. So
I mean, this is like the two like deviations of understanding the logic of capital, in my opinion. You have Mao, who thinks it's all just like domination and control. There is no of these like tendencies for the productive forces to develop, basically. That's just like a myth, even though it's much more strongly confirmed than the other thing he talks about, which is like the surplus population increasing. And then there's this other deviation of, well, actually, the logic of capital means everything's going to blow up, like the productive forces are going to keep blowing up forever, and we're going to explode, and AI is going to take control of everything.
Yeah, I mean, and ironically, is basically that's almost left. Well, no, it's not. Left accelerationism is that it'll explode, and then socialism will happen, which is still very close to communization theory, honestly.
Yeah, it's a horseshoe there.
Yeah. And then there's right accelerationism, is it explode, and our robot overlord Cthulhu beast that emerged from all the meth we've allegedly done in China will dominate the undermention of the market and just lead us to a post-human future. I mean, their argument's not that stupid, but it's not that much smarter.
The problem is, one, that it's wrong. Two, even that it's like,
even if it isn't wrong, why would you want that?
Yeah. So why are you telling me this?
like, I think I keep that part quiet, my dude. No, I thought that too. I'm just like, wait, your your vision is literally to just, dude, my friend. This is like a Superman villain's plan.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, certainly, I think some of them want to be like seen as supervillains. Theo, especially, but I think that's a common trope in like Silicon Valley.
yeah, I guess if they can't be heroes, they have to be villains because at least they're world historically important.
Yes.
Um, I am, the mouth domination thing is interesting to me because domination is part of capital, right? But it's just like, this occasionally happens with world systems theorists too, where they'll just start arguing that there literally is nothing liberatory or socializing and about development of capitalism, and then I'm like, they'll start talking about how the feudal workday was less and this, that, and the other, and I'm like, yeah. I mean, some of that's true, but when did people die in in early medieval Europe? I just want to put that to you before you get all like happy about these kind of societies. Like, what did knights do? It's like, who did they terrorize? Because you guys seem to be forgetting a whole lot about the prior forms of social formation also sucking.
Yeah, there's this common like error I think that's made with world system, like various like interpretations that go either two ways. That one, like that because like profit rates equalize, this means that like there must be unequal exchange between the global north and south in order for the like these big like divergences and like trade flows to make sense. Which one, they don't equalize. There's capital. There's like barriers of mobility for physical capital to be installed in lots of these developing countries. And the other thing is that I was having like you could also take it the other way, that because there's like not these equalizing profit rates or something fishy going on, but I mean it's the same issue. I just like I don't find the economics very convincing on a lot of that stuff. That like you do have to admit that at least in most sectors there's some pretty big productivity differences in what's possible, and there's also these same dynamics with like capitalist consumption also apply to the developing world. That if especially if you have like a cabal of like really wealthy people in your country that control everything, which is true for like lots of African countries, lots of Latin American countries. Like that, they're not going to want to invest more. They already get all the money. Why would they want to put some of it towards investment? They're not going to get. They're not going to be able to eat it. you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is just a hard problem, and I think Mao is one thing, but I think you and I both have a critique of communization theory. I will admit that I think EndNote's contribution to the debates in EndNote's volumes 1 through, well, really volumes 2, 3, and 4. The first one's not all that helpful.
I hate the first. I hate it so much.
I know you do. I know you do. You don't like either side of that debate. Um, I used to be more convinced. One, I always thought Debay won that debate against Theory Communiste, and two, that Debay's answer still isn't very good.
No. I thought the opposite. I thought Debay.
So you agree with EndNotes that Theory Communiste won that debate, but
well, I think that they were slightly better. They were still bad, but Daw was just so bad that I couldn't hand him anything.
But I will give you this. I guess my concerns here are the communization theory seems to me to be structurally similar to a couple of theories. Immiseration theory, actually accelerationism too, because accelerationism is left accelerationism is a catastrophic form of the immiseration thesis. And then the the working class didn't do what we wanted it to, cause reasons. And I do in the history of separation think the cause reasons is basically their answer. People could listen to my long discussion with Esri on that, because they basically deny that there was ever a politicized labor movement in the first place, which is like, I was like, okay. But I do think there are questions that EndNotes tries to deal with that basically have not been dealt with particularly honestly. I just think all their solutions are terrible. They do deal with the theory, like at least Benyaev, and I don't know if he's still a communization theorist actually now that he works for the New Left Review these days, but he accepts theory rate of profit, the fall, and the increasing need of organic capital and development of machines, and them being related. Phil Neal does too. And when they're talking about that part of the economy, their writing's actually quite good. But then you like try to figure out what they think the answer to it is, and it's just like riots.
Yeah.
And then the riots will force inter socialization. And I'm like, what? In what ways do riots force socialization? Riots will force socialization, something. We abolish everything, communism. And like no transition whatsoever. No bourgeois intermediary things like time accounting, even much less markets. And
someone needs to make like one of those. There's an old meme about like in capitalism you have one cow and you sell the milk, and then in communism someone steals your cow. Someone needs to do that for like social democracy, where everybody gets gets a cow on paper, and in the communization we abolish cows.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel that way. I mean, but it is interesting because I kind of view one, my most edgelord opinion is like a lot of Marxist Leninism, not all of it, but a lot of Marxist Leninism ends up being social democracy just with more guns and maybe some anti-imperialism. Two, the social democratic people of pretty much all stripes think we can have the early 20th century economy back as the basis for what we're operating on, and that's nuts. They also seem to deny not just the theory of rates of profits default. There's other things that, like the Jacobin crew in particular, just doesn't want to deal with. That inflation hurts the very poor. That social goods is not the same as building class power. What's another one? Oh yeah, co-ops in a world of markets still operate under capitalist logic, or they don't stay open. Like, on and on and on. And I guess if I encountered those things as the primary forms of socialism, which I did, and when I did, you know what, communization seemed pretty. I mean, I was like, at least these guys acknowledge that bullshit can't go on forever. But I think we're in a weird cul-de-sac right now. I was going to ask you, in what ways do you think our current economic stagnation in the United States and in the West in general, but particularly in the United States, has led to how has that affected the consciousness of the Marxian and post-Marxian left in America? because it seems to be part of what you're hinting at, that there actually is a relationship between these stats and our inability to understand these stats.
Yeah, I think that there's, I think that there's almost like there's a lot of wishful thinking, right? There's like almost like, oh, how back in the day there was all these thoughts that, oh, like communism will unleash the productive forces and usher in this like incredible new growth, except for like social democracy. Like if we just had the same Keynesian policies, we'll have the same growth as the post-war period, ignoring all the contradictions of how that played out.
Yeah, and that it hasn't happened. And have people looked at the gross weights of the Nordic countries? It's not like they're markedly higher than the rest of the West.
No,
Like
it's but like there's this, there's that. And the same thing applies to like MMT, which is just an extension of it's the post Keynesian stuff. But then there's also like this sort of pessimism. I think it's a weird positionality because I can't quite tell if it's defeatism or not. Of like, well, this like the post-industrial condition of the U.S. is now the universal condition, and it is like people thought that the Fordist system had solved the contradictions of capitalism. I think that there's like with endnotes a bit. There's people who think that neoliberalism solved the contradictions of capitalism, and now
by becoming feudalism.
Yes, it's just this forever.
I don't think that's just endnotes. I mean, that's like so ubiquitous right now. Like Giannis Varoufakis is talking about that.
Yeah.
Every liberal on TikTok, Nico, just start screaming techno-feudalism the moment you mention Elon Musk.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, so I get why it's like a popular phraseology. I even get why people would think that. I flirted with it myself when I started thinking about how much the economy had become rents, because that distorts the ability to measure the value relationship. But what I've learned from looking at the kind of the work you do and a few other people do is that it distorts it, but it doesn't fundamentally undo it. These things still act like you still trade rents like commodities, and they still act like commodities when you do so. Like, so, also the labor markets, like we don't have serfs. You producing content for Facebook does not make you a serf, because I'm not sure how much value is actually generated by that content. And I don't mean that in an abstract, like valuable. I mean, like literally, I don't know how many profits are made by it at all.
I'm pretty sure it's just redistributing surplus around.
Right.
I feel like the one thing everyone forgets is that like there are in fact still like tendencies of things going on, that there is like the economic development still matters, even if it doesn't feel like it feels like we're like the US is defying gravity, but people don't realize it's defying gravity because they've been here the whole time, and it's just like the water they breathe.
I refer to us as having like a 2 decades long Wile E. Coyote moment.
Yeah.
Like,
which is about how long it was for the USSR too.
Right. And I'm like, we might, like the United States might survive this, but not as it is right now. That's over. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, man. It's dark. I guess to pivot a little bit, where do you think we should be looking? I mean, clearly, like you and I have constantly had a slight difference of view of China, although I think it's not a difference in kind, it's a difference in amount. But I do think China gives me some limited hope, which is why I'm a China defensist, even though I don't think it's solved some of these fundamental problems yet. And I'm not sure, Will, you seem to be more optimistic that it's at least creating a path where it could. And I think that's fair. But where else should we be looking right now? Because it does feel like for example, you are associated with a neo-Trotskyist tendency, kind of loosely. And my critique of them is like, I really like them and they're often right. And they're right about the problems of economism. But sometimes their fear of economism leads them to not take economics seriously enough, like, period. You might disagree with me because they're your comrades, but, I just don't see a lot of writing about economics in that sense in a lot of their work.
I mean, it's definitely a more of a political focus because it's about like the struggle for democracy is the primary thing. And like that, I think that's good. I mean, it's hard to figure out how exactly you translate like this economic problem into like a real, like a political thing for a time when the socialists are still so marginal that it doesn't, like, nothing we can do is going to affect government policy, really. I mean, even
Right.
if like Zoran wins or whatever, it's not going to really affect the investment rates of New York. Um, like it's a bit of a conundrum, and I know I've said in the past that, like, if the left had just known in the '60s that this was going to come to bite them in the ass, that there were still contradictions of capitalism that could have done something. But I mean, it's kind of difficult to say exactly how you. I mean, the thing with China,
I don't know what they could have done. That's the thing. Is like, I do agree with you, but I'm always like, but what would they would have done though? Because by the '70s, some of them did realize it, and what they tried to do also failed.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think that all you can really do politically is just say what you believe and hope that like other people agree. But it's like with China, like it's not just what China is doing domestically. The fact that China is exerting this pressure on international markets means that like eventually the rest of the world will have to respond.
right.
There will have to be.
But to me, that also means we need to really start paying attention to China in a much more serious way than China good or China bad, because it's going to matter how they negotiate the next 20, 30 years.
Well, it's not just what happens in China. It's like, who is the first to evolve and adapt? And that's really...
Well, it probably won't be us.
No,
but yeah,
probably won't.
I mean, to be fair, historically, why would we assume it'd be us? The former hegemon, it like in their Thucydides trap moment, and that's rarely ever is the person who realizes the situation first. Like, Britain peaked in 1890. I don't think it realized it peaked in 1890 until like 1970.
Yeah.
So like, and some people still don't realize it. So,
yeah.
I think we peaked in the 1960s or maybe even the 1950s, which also means the Pax Americana was like 15 fucking years. Like, and it wasn't peaceful either.
No, they had the Korean War and stuff,
right?
Which was like still like on an industrial scale, like World War II.
Right. I mean, I always think about that. I'm like, yeah, this is where where you and I don't know how you feel about generational logic, but I actually do talk about the baby boomers as the only real generation, in the sense that like the material infrastructure of capitalism as we know it was built around them, and they were such a big population that we actually have forgotten how everything worked before them. And people, I mean, I'm watching the New York Times we made a mistake to assume that the post-war consensus was the norm. And I was like, motherfucker, it was obvious that the post-war consensus wasn't the norm by 1972. Like, but the way this generational logic and this investment terminology and all this has gone, we've been able to not look at that for a long time. I mean, even when we talk about neoliberalism, people say neoliberalism is over. And I've been like, it's ending, right? Yeah. But it can end for a long time. But also, like, you keep on just thinking that all neoliberalism was just global markets. My boy, there were global markets like before there was capitalism. I don't know what you're on. What's ending is that the availability of that profitability of capitalist consumption for the bourgeois class to have any trickle down effect pretty much ended in the aughts.
Yeah.
If it existed in the first place, it only existed a little bit between the 1980 and 2006, and it's been over since then. And we've been kind of flailing in different kinds of policies to not deal with that for a long time. I mean, you had QE, you had the low interest rate years, but
And
eventually,
even when you had the high interest rates, because of the way the system changed, I wrote a blog about this, remember, a few years ago, about how, like, because of the way they changed the Federal Reserve System and the interest rate setting, they ended up still having, like, this positive, like, offsetting impact when they were tightening the rates of just sending lots and lots of money to banks.
Well, that will fix things for you, I suppose. I mean, you know, and I do think the I do think the situation with I'm trying to articulate this in a clear way. I do think it's hard for us to get all the stats together and look at all the things in real time, because it is increasingly more complicated. But there's a lot of people who are just, in response to that, just pretending that the stats don't matter.
Well, I think here's the problem, I think, is that on the one hand, like, people don't understand the stats, they don't understand accounting. On the other hand, the people who do, like the really like economist people on the left, overcomplicate it, because they're specialists and they're focused on this one, like these tests, much more complicated empirical tests of specific theories and stuff. They're not trying to zoom out and look at what's the big picture right now.
Yeah, and that's worrying to me, particularly from the left, because we're supposed to be like, look, as I've said many times, if you don't have power, why aren't you at least honest with yourself? Like, I get why people who are trying to maintain illusions lie to themselves. I don't get why people who don't have those, like, we're not part of the state ideological apparatus in any meaningful sense. Like, we might be a epiphenomenon of it. I will grant that totally, but like, why can't we be honest about this? Because it does seem like there's a block on it. I'm not saying that Soren Mao and people are being dishonest, but I'm saying, like, I do think the Jacobin people are actually kind of willfully ignorant on purpose.
Yeah,
like,
there's definitely both an ignorance and like this like atmosphere of arrogance in a lot of these more academic left circles, and that they don't like care to check, like just do the most basic fact checking of these claims. Like what are the overall statistics tell us? What are the basic historical trends of capitalism? And they're afraid of it because of like people, I don't know, maybe like Steve Pinker pulling out all these stats about how great capitalism is. You can look at it and like you can verify things for yourself empirically, and you don't have to rely on like various charlatans or mediators. More people need to be validating these things themselves, which is the only way. We're just in a bad epistemic environment. And my problem with like Burgess is he'll like talk so much about like logic and stuff like that. Logic isn't the only part of reasoning. You also need facts and you need the context. And if you just lay out like this very like academic argument, but miss like the things that are right in front of you, that's a problem. Like this being rigorous implies going out and checking things.
Well, yeah, I'm always iffy on this, but I think there's a difference to be. One is I think logic is often not where the issues are at.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually don't think it's a very Marxist way to argue that like I would think that yes, if you make an illogical argument as a Marxist, that is a problem, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. But two, as I pointed out to Ben, I'm like, there's not even just one form of logic. Like, it's not even just one form of valid logic. Mm-hmm. Like if you get into like philosophy, it's not just you have dialectical reasoning. There are logics that had different constraints. There's first and second order logics, and we don't ever get to any of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And then more importantly, if our logic's sound, but our axioms are wrong because our facts are wrong, or because our axioms don't make sense, you and I might disagree on many things, but I can tell you what we both agree on, that the experience of qualia doesn't actually matter all that much.
Probably not.
For the problems of class consciousness. Thank you, China Mielville. Because I mean, even the question is kind of a category area, is like, why does Marxism, which does not offer explanation to every single phenomenon in human existence, not offer an explanation for this phenomena that I am obsessed with? Something ipso facto, materialism is wrong. And I'm like, no. Just because I can't prove that like signs are the inputs that cause qualia, the fact that I can posit it and it is coherent means that it is a possible proof, meaning that
it does account for it.
Yeah. Meaning that no, it does not disprove materialism.
Yeah.
And this kind of weird shit, like why is that what we're focused? I'm really baffled actually that we're focusing on stuff like that at this moment in particular.
Yeah.
Like I'm like, how many chickens are coming home to roost, both economically and socially and politically?
My problem, like, there's actually a commonality here between the Melville thing and the analytic Marxism thing, in that both are kind of like showing this deference to these like mainstream academic philosophy or other like social science stuff, which is my big problem with analytic philosophy, which is as like a philosophy of science, as like a general approach. I think that it disregards the idea that Marxists should be doing science as their own thing, and they generally believe that these experts in academia, whether philosophers or social sciences, are where this stuff is supposed to happen, and that this is the proper role. This is where like the actual, there's a division of labor in like who should be doing these things, and analytic Marxism is just taking what the economists, the proper philosophers tell them, and just cross-referencing Marx's claims with that. And that's not what it was about. That's not what Marxism is about. There is a specific, you have to work as a scientist to assess these claims all the way down. You can't just take, like, you especially can't take the bourgeois like academics at their word. That's the part you have to double check and engage with.
Yeah, I think about this in like Romer and the analytic Marxist, where he's just like, well, we can't figure out value theory ipso facto. Marginalism is true.
Yeah.
And I bring up non-Marxist critiques of marginalist assumptions. I'm just like, look at this Keynesian showing how this doesn't actually make sense, but you're just accepting it because it's de rigueur in a neighboring social science. Or game theory is something I actually do use, but I don't use it for like class warfare because the conditions are different. It's this stuff baffles me. And I'm like, so you have problems with the Hegelianism of Marxism, and your answer to it is random academic shit that you take at face value that in some ways seems more problematic than the Hegelian stuff you're replacing.
Yeah. I mean, it's just an epistemic deference to bourgeois authority is the way I would put it. That has led a large part of the left down a dark tunnel, and we just need to be able to create a culture of people doing the sort of intellectual investigation themselves, as opposed to relying on these people.
Yeah. I completely agree, and I mean, I will admit that's a tall demand.
Yeah.
Because it means that we basically have to be willing to go and review stats and stuff and learn all kinds of fields that we don't know, and it's going to lead to very acrimonious stuff internally because we have in some ways we are sort of I know we don't like to reinvent the wheel, but sometimes you actually have to. Or you have to do stuff like you and I were talking about GDP, and we're talking about. I think GDP is a flawed statistic. I think the people who throw it out are basically economics is dumb, and I'm okay, because the categories are bad or whatever, and they're just nah, because economics is dumb. It's just a mechanism of power, and I'm sure, but that doesn't mean that this doesn't tell you anything. Right?
There was a recent article from Palladium where someone was trying to say the headline was something like GDP is bunk or something to that effect, and the actual argument was that the value add numbers don't really add up correctly, but that's not really what people think about when they think about GDP. If you think in terms of conceptually what GDP is, you have the total amount of transactions in an economy, which is nominal GDP, and you're just deflating that by an inflation index, and that's your top line real GDP number. And you can sanity check inflation indexes of by just looking at what prices in a catalog used to be years ago. There's you can sanity check that. Those top line numbers can be off, but they can't be off by that much in the grand scheme of things. And they're also and the nominal number is also double checked several ways. So the composition can get messy, especially with value add. But I don't think that GDP numbers as a whole are that totally wrong about what they're saying they are.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I do think there are problems that you have to adjust for. We mentioned, value add is a problem. Dealing with stuff that is just a wealth transfer that will show up on GDP, but is not actually generating anything new is a problem. But I mean, we can kind of approximate that, and I try to when I talk about it. The idea that it tells you nothing is kind of weird. I mean, it's just it's well, okay, we talk about class
deflated by gold,
right? When we talk about class statistics, I realize that liberals and stuff don't define class in the way I do. But I can still look at those statistics and approximate things based off of what I know from other statistics. So I'm okay, so I know that when liberals report working class, what they mean is doesn't have a college degree. But I also know that this many people are working in this sector, and I can adjust that by however much percent based off of where people are currently employed, and know that we should boost that or subtract that by this much. And a lot of people just don't seem to be willing to do that. They just want to throw the baby out with a basket like with the bathwater, actually, and the basket and everything else. We're just we're even throwing the tub out, like, because it doesn't make any sense to me when we're talking about this, and they're like, oh, I can't know anything about this because the stats are different or because it has a liberal definition of X, and I'm like, yeah, but I can adjust for that. And there are other stats that I can triangulate and approximate it. It was never going to be a perfect knowledge. You don't get perfect knowledge with stats unless you have complete knowledge, which we don't have. So, it's frustrating. Well, thank you, Nico, for coming on. Hopefully this pushes back against the anti-scientific turn in Marxism.
Yeah,
because that's been one of the things I've been really worried about is people either redefining science to the point that it has nothing to do with science and it's just rhetoric, or people who do not have a scientific conception of what we should be doing and think this is all about the imposition of norms. Because I'm always like, norms have to have a material basis to be maintained, otherwise they fall apart. Like, you can believe what the fuck ever, it doesn't matter if you can't reproduce it.
Well, fingers crossed that the people take it seriously.
Yep. All right. You'll be back on the show relatively soon because we're going to be talking about semiotics, and I actually have like 5 of your articles in my queue for RE, most of which are good. I did come down really hard. I'm just going to go ahead and out people. I did come down really hard on your Qualia article, and then I read what you were responding to, and then became way more sympathetic. Because I was just like, oh, this is why you're making the argument this way. Because I was just coming at it from I spent 5 years studying this shit, and I'm really mad about it. Like the problem of consciousness. Effectively, I have this, like, when I was arguing with you about it, I've actually effectively have the same position that you do. It's just like, it's interesting, but I don't think it actually indicates a goddamn thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why in all the essays I wrote about AI and semiotics and stuff, I didn't talk about that at all because I didn't think it mattered.
It's just like, because I just, I don't want to get into, I don't want to get into the whole debates about like pea zombies and shit because I just don't care. Like, I admit that I do think the question for me that is interesting is does the existence of qualia either internal to our consciousness and external to our consciousness, like whether or not it exists in our heads or outside of our heads? To me, I don't know that there's a lot of metaphysical questions that come from that.
I mean, honestly, it comes down to like what are the definition these people are willing to accept is if you accept that there's a pattern to thought that you can identify in other things, then the problem is solved. It's like it exists out in the world. We can identify things that can do that. Right. But if you don't, then there's why are we debating this? It's stupid.
Well, I mean, here's the thing that I was basically kind of thinking. Is China Mieville a crypto Platonist and doesn't even know it?
I don't know.
Like, I'm like serious because I was like, it's a problem of qualia that you think that there has to be an external form beyond the fact that we are constructing a sense impression from formal structures that we see in the material world. Is the fact that those formal structures are recognizable and you have to posit a third thing like an eternal form that is not material for that to make sense to you, because no, you don't.
It's funny, like how many people do this because there's also he mentions Richard Seymour, who's also like embraced dualism because he was dissatisfied with materialism, and it's like, why are you doing this? This is, I mean, I guess it's just because those are the philosophy that people read.
We've been slagging on Marxist-Leninists. What happened to Trotskyists? Did they all get hit in the head with a rock? Like,
sometimes it seems like that. It's the most likely explanation.
Because I'm just like, wait, like, your answer to the problems of consciousness is dualism? I mean, I don't get that, like monism versus imperial criticism by Lenin is probably the least like convincing Lenin text ever. But my dudes, we had dealt with this for a while. Like, it's not like, it just feels like, I don't know. Are we just dealing with Gen Xers who are facing death?
Like, that's a possibility, and they're all Gen Xers for some reason.
I mean, they're all about 10 years older than me, so I'm just like, so I guess what I am.
If I get into dualism as like a midlife crisis thing or something, then hit me in the head with a rock.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess my thing is like, if I ever start feeling this way, I should just become a monk and not say anything. Like, just be like, I'm going to go contemplate the mountains now. I'm not gonna fuck up Marxist theory. I'm just gonna quietly walk away. Because I mean, I wanted to cover it on RE, but I went to the first paragraph and I was just counting the number of equivocations, and then finding later on when he'd admit they were equivocations and then be like, but they're not though, but they are, but they're not though. And I know that sounds like incredibly uncharitable, but to talk about Marxists really care about consciousness as if we care about qualia, or that the consciousness of an aggregate becoming a collective with agental power is the same thing as worrying about why I experience the color orange, is weird. And they're like, oh, there's got to be a line because of like psychoanalysis or some shit. And I'm like, look, I realize there's a problem in the Marxist theory of mind because it was come up in the 19th century. But like, what your answer to it seems to be like the 5th century.
Yeah.
Like, so I mean, it actually made me appreciate Sora Mao because I it's like at least he's kind of still a Marxist. But I will say that all this seems to be like, did anyone even understand what they were saying they believed in the first place? I guess that's my question. And we can't answer it today. It's not going to be answered on this interview. This like last 15 minutes of both of us just kind of ranting. No, go ahead. Okay. Yeah. Like, because I just feel like, man, I've spent 20 years struggling with shit. And you guys, I mean, Richard Seymour is one of the people who got me, you know, thinking about Marxism when he was blogging in like 2005. Wow. You know, and seeing him, you know, seeing him do this is like, this feels like Les Kolakowski all over again. Like, and people who don't know who I'm talking about, but like I just, are we just experiencing the 80s fallout of the 70s and 60s left again? Is that where we're at? Like it's just kind of a bummer. Yeah. I mean, you know,
at least I got a blog out of it.
You did. The amount of people who shared that article as if it was profound, and I'm like, I was like, one, if it wasn't Marxism, we wouldn't even be talking about this, because this has been a debate in cognitive philosophy since like the 90s. And
it's like a post like this on Less Wrong every other month.
Yes. And you know, those weird rationalists who become fatuous Christians. It's just like, okay, man. Anyway, I would cut this out, but I'm gonna keep this in because I don't know. Why do we need friends? I can make more enemies just talking about how fucked up everything is.
Don't have enough enemies.
All right. And on that note, you will be coming back to the show. We'll be talking about semiotics with your friend Leaf, and I'm sure it'll be an interesting debate because I think our differences are I don't know. I'm actually still trying to figure out how different our differences are. I think there's just a lot of times where I'm like, where my answer is like, I think that is a viable answer, but you can't prove it. Like,
Fair
and you're just like, yeah. And I'm like, okay. So we'll see. And I think it will give us some time to clarify more, even in more depth, what you mean by structures. There is a friend of the show, Eli Sanesh, who is also wants to come in and talk to me about some of your structural analysis from the standpoint of information theory. So I'll send that to you in Leif, or Leif or Leif. How do I say his name?
I don't know. Leaf, I think.
Leif. Okay. I tend to make everything more complicated and then making things sound foreign for no fucking reason. But but then if I don't do that, I'm wrong too. So, so anyway, on that note, thank you for your time. People should really. I will say this: your Substack, whether I agree with it or not, is actually one of the few Marxist Substacks that I learned something from. As opposed to I just yell at.
Wow,
Because there's a lot of Substacks that are Marxist and I'm just like, oh yeah, you discovered tailism again. Great. Fucking awesome. Let's just try this for the 85th millionth time. Oh, you learned that there's a business cycle. Woo! Anyway, take care, Nico.
All right, take care too.
All right.